Hey everybody, welcome back to the Sheepdog Project podcast. Doc Simpson here with you as always. What a crazy 2018 it has been, and the year is finishing crazy busy, I mean by that. So just got back to a trip to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. Went out there for now is it biannual or semi-annual? I can never figure it out. I don't know which one it means every 6 months. You think, does biannual mean twice a year or every other year? I can never figure that out. So it's one of the two meetings that they have every year of the Committee for Tactical Emergency Casualty Care. So on the military side, we have the Committee on Tactical Combat Casualty Care, and then the Committee for Tactical Emergency Casualty Care is the civilian equivalent. So this is doctors that are directors of EMS systems, directors of SWAT teams, wealth of experience, a lot of military experience, a lot of law enforcement experience. Great pleasure to be in the room with a lot of like-minded individuals, people that are forging the way ahead in how we get the word out to people on what they should be doing. Not only agencies, not only first responders, not only law enforcement, SWAT teams, but civilians as well. So these are the guys that are setting the standard for that, the guys and girls that are setting the standard for that. It was a real privilege to be in the room with them, get to interact with them, voice my opinion, offer some insight. Little sneak peek ahead, I think I'm probably going to be taking a more active role with that body, and I've been invited to speak at their next meeting, which is going to be occurring at the Special Operations Medical Association Scientific Assembly. So really looking forward to that. So shout out to all of my friends that all my new friends that I encountered there with the Committee for Tactical Emergency Casualty Care. Also want to give my international shout out of the week. This is going to be a new thing on the podcast. So I put out the word that I wanted all of our international listeners to start writing emails, and they have. So this week, special shout out to Zolo in the Slovak Republic. Shout out to you, Zolo. Thanks very much for your email. Keep listening. Keep being a sheepdog. For those of you that haven't done so yet or been looking for an opportunity to do so for whatever reason, you can email me. My email address is mike@sheepdogresponse.com. If you have questions about the podcast, about guests we've had on previous episodes, topics we've covered, you want to give suggestions on topics you want to see in the future, that's something we can do. If you have questions about anything medical, how should you be training? What should you be carrying? Of course, I've been fielding a lot of questions still on martial arts gyms. I think I've vetted martial arts gyms in probably half the country by now, which I don't mind doing. I'm enjoying it. I actually had a repeat. I've actually had gotten a call from 2 different residents of Fargo, North Dakota, to vet the local gyms in the area, and gave both of them some guidance, and I hope it works out for them. But again, email me, mike@sheepdogresponse.com, if you have any questions about how you should be training, things you should be doing in your diet, your supplementation, your workout, whatever it might be, any question over a previous episode. I'm always here to answer those. I can't tell you, no matter how much of my day I spend doing it, I get an immense amount of pleasure in interacting with you guys. And if you're listening from somewhere outside the continental United States, I definitely want to hear from you. I want to know how you heard about us, what you do with what you hear, what it's like where you are, how you're training. I want to hear all that stuff. Again, I'm getting a lot of questions about martial arts, and one thing that I did want to bring up really quick, not to dwell on the subject too much because I want to get to the topic of the day, is I've been seeing a lot of these systems. Okay, I'm using the quotation marks. So there's a lot of bogus science out there. There's a lot of people, a lot of snake oil salesmen and saleswomen that are going to try to convince you that they, in spite of tens of thousands of years of martial arts, in spite of the fact that man has been engaging in unarmed combat since the first 2 men stood in front of each other next to a fire fighting over the cooking carcass. This has been going on for tens of thousands of years, and there's people that are out there that are going to try to sell you this line that somehow they have scientifically cracked the code, that they figured this out. Most of these are completely bogus, okay? You'll see them make a lot of outrageous claims. They'll use a lot of big words, a lot of direct quotes from Wikipedia on the science this, the neurology that, hardwired in your DNA, whatever. And the fact of the matter is they can't cite any double-blind controlled studies that prove anything they say. All right. They'll get a couple of people to weigh in on it, usually of questionable credentials, if they have anybody weighing in at all. But a lot of what I'm going to say at the end here is all these places that have these pseudo-scientific names, unless they can tell you who the neurologists, neuroscientists, and neurosurgeons, who all these other people are that are weighing in on this, unless they can quote them by name and show you where they've been published, proving what they say is true, it's all what Dolce likes to call bro science. Okay, it's all stuff. They're taking maybe something that's a little bit true, but they're then trying to extrapolate that into why their system is this magical, basically shortcut. Because what are they trying to sell you? They're trying to sell you a shortcut. They're trying to convince you that, no, you don't need to go and study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Kempo or something for 12 to 15 years to master it and get good at it, because this is already hardwired in your DNA and we just got to release it, and we've figured out how to do that. Be very leery of anybody that uses the phrase, and I'm going to put this in quotes, our experts. Our experts have determined. Usually when somebody says our experts, they don't have any experts, okay? If you have specific questions about specific places, and I'm not singling any specific system out and talking about this, I'm giving a generalization, but a generalization that I have generally found to be true. So, and if anybody is listening to this that wants to counter that, and you say, no, I have scientific proof, we did a 1,000-person cohort and we proved this, that this works for this reason, or we have identified the gene or the area of the brain that specifically has to do with fighting, hey, shoot me an email. I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. I'm more than happy to have you on the program and talk about your scientific evidence if you have real scientific evidence that has been peer-reviewed. I'm more than happy to do that. So enough about that. What I want to talk about today is I want to talk about use of force. This is something that came up kind of stemming out of the last couple of podcasts, and I did get a couple of very specific emails from law enforcement officers regarding use of force, because of course I've put the offer out there that if your department has questions about use of force, about what's dangerous, what's not dangerous, I'm more than happy to come out there and speak as a medical expert on this topic. I'm an emergency medicine physician. My undergraduate was in health sciences with a minor in biology. So I do understand the science, the anatomy, the physiology, a lot of what happens when somebody's fighting, and I understand what things can be potentially very dangerous and what things, although they may look dangerous to the layman, are not necessarily dangerous. And these are things that I'm happy to address. Also, I'm a practicing fight physician. I've worked hundreds, if not thousands of fights. So I've seen this put into practice. I know what moves get people legitimately hurt. I know what moves are safe. And from a use of force aspect, I think it's something that needs to be addressed for a lot of reasons, because this has really come to the forefront in the last couple of years. We're in a society on the cusp of a change. And just watching the news last night, I was watching Fox News, and they said that nationwide, applications to become law enforcement officers, applications to law enforcement academies are down by like a third. That's a big drop, especially when you consider that a lot of these departments are already very much understaffed. The fact that now they're having, again, a third less applications, that's very troubling. That tells me that there's not going to be enough men and women in blue out there doing that difficult job, keeping their community safe, keeping families safe, looking after life, limb, and property. That's a problem. And if you look at the root causes of that, I think a lot of it has to do with what we've seen over the last 8 to 10 years, in that I think there's been a very unfair and unflattering portrayal of law enforcement, particularly in social media. You have organizations out there like Cop Block, some other organizations which, quite frankly, are could or should be classified as domestic terrorist organizations if they're not already, because basically they're anti-law enforcement. And this has caused a big problem. You know, that YouTube is replete with videos of supposed police brutality. And I watched a couple of videos yesterday and getting ready for this. One of them was like, clear case of police brutality. The police are literally talking to a guy in a congenial fashion the entire time and basically handcuffing him. And he does cooperate, and then they take him away. And I'm watching the whole video, and I'm like, where was the brutality in that? But the line that is drawn for what we will call brutality now has changed. And of course, you have these folks out there who call themselves sovereign citizens or free travelers or whatever it might be, free inhabitants. And they just love to argue with police, which is completely ridiculous. Okay, let's be honest. So there's two things that are contributing to that. Number one, they weren't raised right. And number two, they're stupid. Okay. And I know the argument is, oh, you'll see college professors getting in these arguments with police. Okay. Education does not equal intelligence. Okay. If you argue with a police officer in performance of their duties, you're stupid. Okay. You do what the police officer tells you. And if the police officer was legitimately in the wrong, you're going to have your day in court. But it's not the time to argue that there when tempers are flaring, when tensions are high in the moment. And if you're listening to this podcast, you know all this. I'm preaching to the choir, but it boggles my mind. I don't understand it, because I was always taught to be respectful to law enforcement officers. And in my younger days, I've had a couple of brushes with the law. And by and large, I was very respectful, even in a case where I ended up being in a cell for a few hours for legitimately trying to grab somebody who was trying to hurt a police officer. And that's a long story that I can tell in another episode. But I do want to talk about use of force, and I want to talk about how it's looked at in society and some things I think everybody should think about. I'm doing this solo today. I didn't bring in a guest, even though we have, of course, multiple law enforcement officers on staff with Sheepdog. I didn't want this to be slanted in one direction as it pertains to one department and things that they are taught or not taught. I wanted this to be a little bit more generalized and generic. And so in the future, I might circle back around and either have Travis or Jeffro on to talk about this again, to do some follow-up. But for right now, basically what I want to talk about is where we are, why some things have been deemed unsafe when they don't necessarily need to be, and where I think we should go. I've got a fundamental problem with the term use of force as it is, okay? Because we have use of force guidelines. If you're in law enforcement, you have guidelines as to your use of force. The bad guys don't have use of force guidelines, right? They're not constrained by anything like that. They're constrained by the law, but they've already demonstrated a disregard for the law, okay? And in many cases, if you're serving a warrant or doing a high-risk stop on somebody who's maybe a 3-time loser already, they might think that it's beneficial to them to either flee the scene or to put up a fight and try to disengage. Let's remember, most people who cross paths with the law have not made really good life decisions to begin with. They've made some pretty poor life decisions. Okay, not all, but the majority. I think we're all comfortable in saying that they've made some bad decisions. Now they're crossing paths with a law enforcement officer. They don't have anything to lose, and they might legitimately think they're in the right. So they don't have any constraints on what they feel they can do, because for them this is survival. This is, if you lock me up, I'm never going to see my family again. I'm going to go to jail forever. So from a survival standpoint, I'm going to do whatever I need to do, up to and including deadly force, to get away from you. If you're a first responder in law enforcement, you don't have that luxury. Okay, you have very strict parameters, and the reason this is a problem. So let's look at the Mayweather-McGregor fight. Mayweather beat Conor McGregor. Floyd Mayweather beat Conor McGregor in a boxing match within the rules of a sanctioned boxing match. If that had been a fight with no rules, I don't think anyone in the world, up to and including Floyd Mayweather, would deny that Conor McGregor would have beat Floyd senseless. Okay, in a fight with no rules, the rules are what saved Floyd. Okay, and if you look, there was a couple of times early on in the rounds that many people even said that Conor won, that Floyd would turn away, basically presenting the back of his head, set up in a way, and of course Conor got a warning for hammer punches because he got a little bit frustrated. Had there been no rules in that fight, there would have been a different outcome. And the same is true on the street. If you're in an altercation and one individual, that being the suspect or the person that you're interacting with, has no rules rather, and you have rules, you're at a distinct disadvantage when it comes to that. Another big problem that we face today is we live in the age of cell phone video. And because we live in the age of cell phone video, everything gets filmed. So everything's going to find its way on social media probably within the next hour, and ultimately probably going to end up on YouTube and wherever else on the 6 o'clock news. Sometimes these things are actually very helpful, because often they'll exonerate the police officer. And I think body cameras have gone a long way towards doing that. They basically have, in the majority of cases, have proved that the officer was in the right. There have been a few times it's gone the other way, but the majority, they've actually been a great thing for police officers, even to the point that some organizations have said that police body cam video shouldn't be admitted as evidence against defendants because they feel that it's an unfair portrayal and can possibly be taken out of context, which I find hilarious. But because of that, you out there on the front lines, you have to be very careful of what you're going to do and how you're going to interact with somebody, because this is all, it can be edited in such a way that they might not see the 20 minutes leading up where they were cursing you, kicking at stuff, knocking stuff over, throwing stuff, refusing to cooperate, spitting on you, possibly even in a physical altercation with you. And only what will go up is that 2 to 3 minute period where you have had all that you can take, and you're using the tools available to you to get that person to comply, and it ends up portraying you in an unflattering light. That's a problem. I'm going to talk about real quick. I'm going to go through, I've got a use of force pyramid here in front of me. And I'm going to try to go through it really quickly. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. And I will say this. So this is from the Philadelphia Police Department Use of Force Policy Directive 10.1. So basically at the bottom of this period, you had no force. Use of force is not required. The officer options are verbal commands and officer presence. So just being present is your option, and to give verbal commands. Offender threat, they are obedient, compliant, and non-aggressive. Okay, this is a normal interview. This is a non-issue. No question there that there shouldn't be any force here. Moderate to limited force. So even though they have them listed in reverse order, I'm going to give the threat first. So let's say the offender threat is they are resisting and non-compliant. So the officer has given them a directive and they are not complying. Okay? And usually in most of these videos, what you see is the officer gives them repeated chances to comply, right? It's usually not, I'm going to need you to step back away from the vehicle, pause, and then the officer initiates moderate force. That's usually not what happens. Usually they're given multiple and ample chances. So in this case, it says if they are resisting and non-compliant, the officer option is physical control holds or OC spray, okay, which I'm assuming is whatever Philadelphia is using as a form of pepper spray. So that's actually, in my opinion, pretty quick to go to OC spray. So, put your hands on your head, no. So by the letter of this, put your hands on your head, no, spray in the face, okay? So that's completely authorized. I've voiced my opinion about sprays on the show before when Travis was on. I'm not a big fan of them because that's a person you're eventually going to have to lay hands on, because if you sprayed them, I assume they're coming into custody. So do you really want to now be wrestling with them, getting that on you, getting that on your uniform, then getting it in the back of your cruiser? Probably not. So I'm not a big fan of OC spray. I think physical control holds is a little bit better. We're going to talk about spray and tools, the tools that you have available, and why I think they can be problematic as I get further along. So now we're talking about less lethal force is the next thing. So less lethal force, that's when the offender threat is they are physically aggressive or assaultive behavior with immediate likelihood of injury to self or others. Okay, so basically they've gone beyond this stage of they're just not complying, and they are aggressive at this point. The officer's options are electronic weapons, so a taser, ASP, or baton. So at the less lethal force, you are now at this point authorized to use some more of your tools. Okay, and again, I'm going to talk about why I think that's a little bit of a problem. Then you get all the way up to deadly force, and this would be indicated if the offender behavior includes reasonable belief that there is an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury. So death or serious bodily injury. Okay, so it doesn't mean they had the capacity to kill you or kill someone else, but they had the capacity to do serious bodily injury. And at that point, the officer is authorized to use their firearm. On the surface, I don't see anything wrong with this use of force pyramid, right? It seems pretty cut and dry, but it's how these are worked in and what people are allowed to do in here. And I'm going to address specifically when it talks about physical control holds, what people are and are not allowed to do. So something that we've noticed, and you'll see it recurring in a lot of these videos. So people that have had a little bit of training will look at videos. And this is something that Tim says at our courses, and I've repeated it quite often because it's dead on accurate. Ineffective force will often appear to be excessive force. And what that means is sometimes if you look at somebody trying to swim who doesn't know how to swim, and they're flailing and they're thrashing arms and they're making big splashes everywhere and everything else, they're exerting a lot of effort, but it's completely ineffective. And unfortunately, oftentimes, physical force in the form when people are putting hands on a subject is ineffective because they don't have the training, they haven't practiced it. But because there's so much flailing and splashing and everything else, the equivalent is, of course, you're doing that in the pool, you're not moving through the water. You're doing that to a subject, you're not really doing them any harm, and they're not complying. But it's a big show, right? It's loud, it's boisterous, it looks excessive. If somebody films that, it looks excessive. There's a few great examples of this. So there's a YouTube video that's out there of a woman who was arrested on a beach. I believe it was in New Jersey, who's being subdued by two, I don't think they were police officers, I think they were like beach security officers. And they're using totally ineffective force, okay? And of course, everybody's like, oh my God, they hit this woman like 10 times or whatever it is. They're these little kitten punches that are completely ineffective. But because they're wasting energy on ineffective force, it looks like excessive force, right? It could have been done more efficiently, more effectively, and that's what should have happened. More recently, I saw a video, and I think this happened actually very recently. It was in a convenience store. There's an individual had been accused of passing off a counterfeit $20 bill. The police officers questioned the individual, and there's no sound in the video, so I don't know exactly what was said, but eventually they decide that they're going to go ahead and take the individual into custody. And their initial movements are extremely ineffective. And there ends up being a lot of thrashing around, some running from one location to another, banging into some displays, and ultimately falling onto the floor in a heap with two officers and the individual. So it looks like this, it looks to the layman like excessive force. It's not, it's just ineffective. It's judging from the way they tangled up, the way they fell, I doubt the individual was hurt in any way. But again, it's ineffective force, so it has that appearance, that violence of action that makes it appear to be excessive. This is really exemplary. Every video that you see out there where you see multiple officers trying to subdue an individual, this is always just magnified, because There's very, very few times in that where there's proper cooperation going on, where there's communication, where one officer is taking charge and saying, hey, we're going to do it in this fashion. So usually they're all pulling against each other, kind of doing their own thing. So what does that look like on a cell phone video? On a cell phone video, that looks like 6 police officers are beating a guy up. That's what it looks like, right? A little story from my own experience. I was an officer of corrections at a small prison in the state of Georgia. Had an incident like that where I ended up engaging with an individual and actually had it under control, was getting him back into his cell, and the deputy warden and one other individual decided to jump in. Now there's 3 of us on him, and in a very confined space, going into an isolation cell. So what ends up happening is one individual dove right into a headlock, and then in the ensuing fall, the other individual lost control of the inmate and ended up grabbing my leg. So, of course, this was the age before cell phone videos, and it was in the prison, so obviously the inmates wouldn't have had one, but had that been on film, it would not have looked good for us. Okay, the inmate was completely in the wrong. He was assaulting an officer when the whole thing went off, and he wasn't hurt. The other 2 individuals, the deputy warden and the other individual, were actually probably the only people that were hurt in that, because they dove in and basically fell to the ground. But extremely inefficient, and again, would have looked excessive. Think of it this way too. I've always found it frustrating that when these incidences happen and those videos go up, this individual then gets to brag everybody about how it took 5 cops to bring him in. And really that wasn't the case. It took 1 cop to bring him in with 4 cops kind of pulling against each other. So what needs to happen in situations like that is an officer who does have some experience needs to speak up, take charge, direct everybody else's efforts in a better fashion. And I know that's oftentimes easier said than done. I'm not saying it's an easy job. But the bottom line here is being comfortable with hands-on force, okay? That first step of tools before you go to OC spray or anything else is going to lessen the likelihood that you need any of those tools, okay? And the tools are your pepper spray, your baton, your taser, and ultimately your firearm. You want to lessen the likelihood that you need to go for any of those. And the way you do that is by training and training regularly, not the 2 to 4 times a year, or in some departments it's even less than that, when you have to put on a pair of shorts and a t-shirt and go to the academy gym and kind of refresh on this stuff. That's not enough. That is not enough to keep you adequately trained to do that. You need to be training 3 to 4 times a week, right? If me as a layman, if I'm training 2 to 3 times a week, you need to be training more than that. And you need to be fully prepared. You need to be comfortable. You need to be comfortable in bad positions, in good positions. Know what those positions feel like, and know how to maximize and leverage the use of your tools from better positions rather than depending on your tools. When all you have is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And if all you have is a taser and OC spray, that's what you're going to want to go to every time. And you need to know how to put your hands on people, and it's going to be more effective, better for you, better for everybody. All right, and you're not going to get looked up because, hey, this officer has had 3 taser deployments a month every month. That looks bad, right? And you don't want that scrutiny on you because you're legitimately out there trying to do your job. But the long and the short of it is departments and individuals have become far too dependent on these tools, and the tools have become a shortcut. And it's this way in everything in society, right? We're always looking for shortcuts, things to make our lives easier. And we come up with these tools and we think, hey, this is going to lessen how much we have to use our gun, so we're going to use our taser. I'm going to go on here in a little bit and tell you why that's not necessarily the case. But dependence on tools will bite you. All right, and we've seen this before when officers whip out the tools in a hurry. If that tool is then negated, you don't have anything. Right? So, but if you're comfortable just using your hands and putting your hands on people, and you can always start with that, even if you can't deconflict the situation with just your hands, then you're in a better position to go for those tools. So I'm going to give you another example. So the Oklahoma City bus shooting, that's a situation that went from zero to gun, like right away. Right away, that went from zero to gun. And I don't know from the point of view on the officer who drew down on that suspect, and ultimately he was shot and killed. And for those of you not familiar, this was an individual that was going through a psychotic episode. He was on an Oklahoma City bus. Bus driver called police. Police met them at the next stop. And the individual didn't want to get off the bus. And the officer very quickly drew her sidearm. I don't know what the verbal exchange was. And I don't know from her point of view if to her it looked like he had a weapon in his hand or not. But the gun came out very quickly, and then the gun was out, and she closed distance with the gun in front of her. So she basically presented a gun into the face of a person going through a psychotic episode, and he grabbed the gun. So then the ensuing is now they are wrestling over a gun. If that had been hands first, then if they wouldn't have been wrestling over a firearm. Okay. And again, split-second decision on the part of the officer. I'm not going to judge her for that because I didn't see it through her eyes. I don't know what she was seeing. And certainly there was, the left hand of the suspect was not necessarily visible to her because he was holding onto the doorway. She could have thought that he had a gun or a knife or whatever it might be, and that the driver who was right behind him was immediately in danger. I'm not here to second guess all of her decisions. I'm just saying that if someone is extensively trained and comfortable going hands-on sooner and tools later, then there is the potential that maybe that could have ended differently. Taser use, very prevalent, but it has steadily been on the decline, we think, over the last couple of years. And I think that's because such a spotlight has been shown upon taser use, but it was rising for a long time. It looks like now it might finally be on the decline. There was a study done by the Chicago PD, basically evaluating taser use and end outcomes, whether that resulted ultimately in a firearm not being needed or not. And here's what they found out. I'm going to quote this directly. A study by Chicago PD showed research released this week finds that the Chicago Police Department's adoption of tasers resulted in a reduction in officer injury, but no effect on firearm use by law enforcement. In other words, conflicts that were going to end in firearm use ended in firearm use. Whether a taser was there and used in the interim or not, it did not matter. The number of firearm uses remained the same. Now, to me, that statement is a win because there's a reduction in officer injury. Okay? People that wouldn't stop and ended up in an armed conflict with police or whatever it might be, that's secondary to me, okay? Because I want all police to go home at the end of the day. I do think it's important. Obviously, we don't want innocent people being shot, but that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is whether tasers are doing what we initially thought they were going to do, which is fewer people in encounters with police are going to get shot, okay? Again, to me, it's more important police go home every day. And I think that's probably what's important to you too. But that's not what is important to the bean counters. That's not what is important to the people setting policy. And that's not what is important to the people in the neighborhoods that you're out there policing. Okay. And this is the age that we live in. And those are the people who depend on you for protection. So they do have to have some presumption that they're going to be taken care of and not get shot. We could debate that all day long, right? Best way not to get shot is not to be doing anything wrong. Okay. Yes, there are instances where people get shot and they weren't necessarily doing anything wrong, but those are rare, and we know they're rare, and every study shows that they're rare. But again, if we're going to evaluate tasers for the reason that supposedly they were adopted, then they should be reducing that as well, and they're not. So the Axon, Taser has changed the name of the company to Axon, and their website reports that all total, there have been, and this was as of a couple of days ago, there have been 3,876,210 uses to date of tasers, with 99.75% of those resulting in no serious injury. Okay, that's great. But 99.75 of that, if you do the math, that means that 9,690 of those deployments did result in serious injury. So it's not benign, right? Statistics only matter when you're not the person on the bad side of the statistics, right? Statistics are great, but if you're one of those 9,690 people who had a cardiac event, had a fall, and resulted in an open skull fracture or whatever it might be, that's a little bit different, okay? A report by Reuters. So Reuters did some research, and I couldn't find exactly where they were getting their numbers from, but this was published not long ago. Reuters reports that there have been 1,005 deaths following people being tased. This is disputed by Axon. They claim that the number is, I think, in the 20s. But according to Reuters, the data they have worldwide says there have been 1,005 deaths. Now, only 153 of those deaths listed taser as a contributing factor on the autopsy. So 1,005 people who got tased end up dead, okay, but they might have been dead from another cause. But 153 deaths did specifically list the taser as a contributing factor. And I can tell you, some places that I've worked, officers are required to bring suspects that have been tased in custody into the emergency room to get evaluated. And I know that although I've never personally seen an EKG abnormality, a cardiac rhythm abnormality in any of those patients, I have seen quite a bit that they're in what we call rhabdo, which means basically that electrical current has caused them to break down muscle tissue, and that is in their circulatory system, and their kidneys have to filter it out. Basically, they're peeing out muscle that's been broken down by the electrical current. And everyone I've seen who's been tased has a mild form of rhabdo going on. Rhabdo is not a huge deal if you've worked out hard. If you've ever run 8 miles, you've probably had it. But still, it's something that it's not completely benign. The ACLU, who I'm not necessarily a fan of, claims that there is 1 death for every 600 people that get pepper sprayed. Okay, so that's people that have anaphylactic reactions, people that have reactive airway issues, severe asthma, possibly people that are blinded by it and then run off of a ledge and fall. But they're saying for every 600 people that you pepper spray, 1 person is going to die. Okay, and you combine that with the numbers of the taser deaths, and some places are saying that 50 people are dying from tasers a year. I can't find anything to necessarily substantiate that number, but that's what's being said. So these are tools that we think of as being relatively benign when we have our departments and municipalities have outlawed certain physical restraint moves that officers could use, and I'm going to talk about some of those specifically, i.e. the rear naked choke. The thought process being that rear naked chokes kill people, right? The chokehold kills people, and that these things don't. And I think there's numbers out there to show that these things are not totally benign. And I'm not advocating that we don't use these. I think these are valuable tools we should continue to use. But I think departments and municipalities need to be aware that they're not without risk, and maybe there are some things you can do with your hands that are of lesser risk and would fit right into that pyramid of escalation of force that you could do if you had all those tools available. Because I don't believe in taking tools away from people. As I said, so right now, some data to support 50 taser deaths a year and 13 pepper spray deaths per year. Chokeholds. Chokeholds were banned in the early 90s. A review of the literature was conducted, and it was discovered that in the entirety, in the entire time chokeholds were being used by law enforcement, and I don't know what that time period is, let's say they started being used in the 50s or 60s, so let's say it was 30 to 40 years. Only 14 people were ever killed. 14 people. That's not a tremendous number. Okay? And if you look at those chokehold deaths, and this was looked at. So in the article, there was an article in the Journal of Forensic Science in 1987. This is right about the time that chokehold was being outlawed. Found that in the entire history of judo, going back 105 years, there was no documented case of a death because of, and judokas, I might be saying this wrong, shimewaza, okay, mataleao, okay, what we call in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, the rear naked choke, that there was no deaths in the practice of judo in 105 years from that move. And that the 14 chokehold deaths that we saw in law enforcement during the time that the chokehold was in vogue, all of those had been either applied either completely improperly, with too much force, or with the adjunct of a tool, i.e. a baton was used, and baton across the front of the airway. All of the autopsy data showed airway fractures or spinal cord damage, which was consistent with improper application of the choke or excessive force and or motion during the choke. Okay, so, and you know this if you roll, right? If you put a rear naked choke on somebody and you sink it very, very deep, they're not going to be able to move and struggle. The more space you give them, the more they're going to be able to move and struggle, and the more they're putting themselves in danger, because that's when they can harm themselves. And I'm going to go into some of those specifics a little bit later on. So in recent memory, we have a couple of cases where this has come up, where we've gotten eyes on this again. And this is why people have told me, because of these recent cases, you're never going to convince people that it's safe. So let's talk about those. The Eric Garner case, probably the most infamous. And this actually, after recording my last podcast with Jeffro, the engineer who records my podcast, Evan, even said to me, he goes, "Hey, what about the Eric Garner case? You said the rear naked choke is safe. What about that?" Well, so let's talk about him. Let's talk about that case. So in his case, yes, the autopsy did not show a fracture of the windpipe and no fracture of the hyoid bone. So he didn't have force applied to the front of his airway. Okay, so it wouldn't fall in with those cases where the 14 reviewed previously. But the video, if you watch the video, it shows a couple of very important things. First, the rear naked choke is being applied improperly. The crook of the elbow is not lined up with the Adam's apple. Okay, he's got forearm across the windpipe, which again is the wrong way to do it. But at no point does it appear that he's, well, we know this from the autopsy, at no point did he apply enough force to fracture the airway or fracture the hyoid bone. So it's just improperly applied, and thankfully it was loose. Okay, if it wasn't loose, the autopsy report would have been different, and what ultimately ended up happening to that officer would have been quite different as well. Garner maintains, this is the second thing I noticed, Garner maintains consciousness and airway patency throughout the video. Okay, he's not losing consciousness, and he says, a big deal was made out of the fact that he says 11 times, "I can't breathe." The fact that he could say 11 times he couldn't breathe. I understand he felt like he was in distress. He had the psychological feeling of suffocation, but he was moving air. You can't say "I can't breathe" 11 times if you're not moving air. So he was. What killed Eric Garner was exceptionally poor health and struggling against his own weight and the weight of the officers. Okay? Whether or not they should have arrested him to begin with, we're not even going to debate that. Okay? I'm here to talk about the mechanics of whether or not a chokehold killed him or not. Eric Garner was morbidly obese. That is clear in the video. He had asthma, both per his patient history and the autopsy finding, and he had a serious heart condition. Okay, so what you have is somebody who's already in increased metabolic demand because of his size. Okay, already has poor exchange of gases because of poor lung tissue, already has an increased metabolic need and a heart condition that's going to be triggered by that exertion. One individual, I believe is a pathologist, went on to say that had Eric Garner not struggled with the police but attempted to run from the police, based on the autopsy findings, he probably would have died from the sprint. Okay, so that's certainly something to think about. Something that definitely lends credence to the severity of Eric Garner's heart condition is Eric Garner's daughter, who was only 27 years old, died 3 years later of a heart attack. Okay, so obviously very strong genetics in that family predisposing to heart conditions. That is undeniable. Multiple reviews of the footage and the autopsy by physicians have included that the choke did not play a role in his death. Okay, the struggle did, and all the other things that I mentioned did, but the choke is not what killed him. Okay, there's no stretch of the imagination where you can say that. Where we ran into a lot of problem with that whole case was a lot of lay people, a lot of people who did not understand when the coroner said cause of death was homicide. They didn't understand that homicide does not mean murder. Homicide does not mean the deliberate killing of one man by another man. They didn't understand that, so they felt that when they misinterpreted, medical terminology versus legal terminology, and so it wasn't surprising to anybody who'd reviewed the footage and understood the autopsy why, after 2 months of very close scrutiny and deliberation, the grand jury chose not to indict. It was pretty obvious. I understand why to the layperson it might not have been obvious, but it was to me. In spite of that, the NYPD police commissioner ordered a review of the use of force policy, and I think the commissioner's hands were tied at that point. I don't think there was any way that you could get away with not doing that. But again, I put this forward. When was the last time the bad guys had to review their use of force policy? They don't, right? What I see in the Garner video, and I also saw it in the video with the individual at the convenience store that they thought was passing off counterfeit bills. Both of those did show what appeared to be using a rear naked choke type hold as a takedown. So, and in the case of Eric Garner, Eric Garner was much taller than the officer, so he couldn't get his arm all the way around. But there are much better, safer, more efficient ways to take somebody down. I just watched a video today. If somebody's facing away from you, on a great way to basically body lock them from behind, use your knee as a knee tap to take them down relatively quickly without any injury to either party. So I would, although I'm an advocate of the use of a rear naked choke for a restraint technique, for a compliance technique, I am not an advocate of its use as a takedown technique. Because I was taught that in old school Army hand-to-hand, basically as a way to throw an arm around somebody's neck and attempt to do lethal damage as you're taking them down. And I don't think that's a good idea. That's not what you're going for. So do not use the rear naked choke as a takedown. But we're going to get more into rear naked choke stuff as we go along. Another example of an improperly applied rear naked choke. The Tashi Brown case, or Tashi Farmer, as he was sometimes known, case in Las Vegas. So again, this was a case of a individual who probably having a psychotic break secondary to some methamphetamine use. The problems there, you can't really see in the video. You can't see the rear naked choke, but you can tell how long it's in place on the body cam footage, and it was in place for too long. It was like 1 minute and 13 seconds. So, which is about 1 minute and 3 seconds longer than it should have been. And even then, even though this was a rear naked choke in place, basically providing occlusion pressure for 1 minute and 13 seconds. But the coroner determined that Tashi Brown had a pre-existing enlarged heart. He had methamphetamine in his system, which increases metabolic demands. Also, he was tasered 7 or 8 times in the course of that encounter. So all of these things combined, basically for a terrible recipe and ultimately a tragic death. But you can't point to that rear naked choke and single it out as the one thing that caused the death. Okay, it may have been applied properly, but it was certainly applied for too long a period of time. So let's talk about the rear naked choke. Let's talk about some numbers. So if you look on IBJJF, the International Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Federation website, they list 3,825 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts. Now, there's actually more. We know that. So those are all the ones that have registered with them. But we know there are more than that. And I know that because I looked up a couple that I know off the top of my head, and none of them were in there. But let's say that number is an accurate number. And let's say that each one of those registered black belts has their own academy somewhere. And I know they don't. Sometimes some academies, you go places, they have a purple belt is the individual running it. Some places they might have 3 black belts. So, but just for argument's sake, to use this as a semi-round number, let's say there's 3,825 Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies out there operating right now, okay? Even if in each and every one of those schools, only one person has a rear naked choke applied per week, and we know it's more than that, right? It's got to be more than that. But let's say only one per week. That is 198,900 times per year that a rear naked choke is being applied. And we aren't seeing deaths from that. And again, we had judo data going back 105 years that nobody have died. I've only heard of one case that I've seen verified of serious injury. I think there might be another. So one in Brazil and actually one in California, where individuals had carotid artery dissections secondary to that. Whether these were applied in a textbook fashion, I don't know. Certainly, at least in the case of that was written up as a medical case study, the individual had the rear naked choke applied and was attempting to turn his head as a defense mechanism, and that is what ultimately resulted in the carotid artery dissection. It's my opinion that a properly applied rear naked choke is a safe and effective way to subdue somebody, okay? As is a head and arm choke. And I understand some people are not allowed to do head and arm chokes, and I think that's ridiculous as well, because if you're in good top position and somebody gives you the opportunity to gift wrap that arm, that's one of my favorite moves, and I think it should be utilized. If the rear naked choke is properly applied, okay, it limits blood flow to the brain by occluding the carotid arteries on both sides, causing lightheadedness, ultimately unconsciousness. There's another theory out there that the pressure applied by the rear naked choke affects what are called the baroreceptors in the carotid arteries, right? I think that's possible, but I think it's a little bit less likely. They're a little bit high up. They'd be a little bit hard to reach, and also there's some other factors that I think make that less likely. It really, in the end, though, it really doesn't matter, okay, in my opinion. If the rear naked choke is taught to be performed slowly, deliberately, your arms sunk in deep all the way through, elbow and the crook of the elbow over the Adam's apple, which will protect the airway. If you're taught to apply slow, even pressure, okay, do a 10-second countdown, right? The anaconda does not squeeze like lightning fast, okay? The anaconda squeezes. You let out a little bit of breath, it squeezes tighter. You let out more breath, it squeezes tighter. That's the same way that a rear naked choke should be applied. Officers should be given very specific guidelines and very strict guidelines on how long they can hold the rear naked choke, okay? No longer than, say, 10 or 20 seconds. If it's used in that fashion, done slowly, deliberately, from a proper dominant position, you have the back with hooks in, you're not trying to get it from a standing position, you're not trying to get it from the side where you're going to throw a forearm across somebody's windpipe. If you're doing all of those things and you're applying it slowly, deliberately, applying slow, even pressure, not cranking the neck, not wrenching the neck, not twisting the neck, okay, that's when you're going to get into trouble. That's when you're going to cause spinal cord damage. That's when you're going to cause an airway fracture. If you do not do any of those things, you hold it steady, apply it slowly, deliberately, and for no more than 10 or 20 seconds, it is a safe and effective means of control. Okay, I can't set policy at your department. Only your department can set policy at your department. But that is my opinion. Okay, my opinion is that it's safe, and how often we see it applied in training tells me that it's safe. I talked about the carotid dissection. Yes, I'm going by some notes here. A common mistake that people make when applying the rear naked choke is, like I said, you don't have good dominant position with hooks in, stabilizing yourself, and you're trying to throw that arm around the neck, and that's when people get into trouble. We say this again and again and again, position before submission, okay? And if you are practiced and skilled in the art of unarmed combat, then you're going to be comfortable biding your time and getting into that dominant position first. You're not going to try to rush a rear naked choke from a side position, from a standing position, from an inferior position. And you won't injure the person that you're putting it on, and you won't injure yourself. And I've talked about this on the show before, man. If you are in law enforcement and if all you knew how to do was always get in top mount or always take the back, and you knew no submissions, you would win every encounter, because you could just hold somebody down until help arrives, or till they gave up, or till you got cuffs on them. If you are comfortable with hands-on violence, you're less likely to panic and have to rush to those tools. We see this in our courses all the time, that you give somebody the tool, and as soon as they're in an inferior position, that's when the tool starts to come out. When gravity's working against them, when the other person's working against them, when they're committing both hands, one or both hands to the tool, and it's real easy to just completely negate and nullify that. But if you're comfortable with the hands-on, the people that are comfortable with the hands-on don't make that mistake, because they stay hands-on until they're in a position where they can comfortably go to their tools, not as a last resort, not in panic mode. That's not how you want to use those tools. Officers that do not train are way more likely to resort to these tools. And we see this time and time again. We know in our courses the officers that train, whether we know they're a brown belt or whatever it might be, or we just know that they've been training, it's evident on the mat. And those officers, when we add tools into the mix, don't rush to those tools. The ones that don't train rush to those tools very quickly, and usually with not good consequences. You need to think of the rear naked choke if you're allowed to use it. And again, if you're not, play this episode of the podcast for your superiors. I'm more than happy to come out there and talk about it. I'll bring diagrams. I'll show them the science, everything else. But the rear naked choke, like anything else, is a tool. So just like I tell you not to rush for your pepper spray, not to rush for your taser, you don't rush to the rear naked choke. You get in that proper position. Yes, this is the third or fourth time I've said it. And you apply it deliberately, slowly, properly, disciplined, methodically, and you only hold it for as long as your department allows, which should be no more than 20 seconds, between 10 and 20. Think about this. You wouldn't rush to use a drill, talking about tools, if it wasn't plugged in. You wouldn't try to swing a hammer if you weren't holding it properly, right? You don't try to get a flathead screwdriver into the slot on a screw from the wrong angle, right? You crawl up under there, you get the proper angle, and you approach it from the right angle. Okay, you need to do that with all of your tools. You need to use your tools properly, or those tools are worthless. So think of the rear naked choke. Think of all of the things you do in unarmed combat as a continuation of your tools. They're just yours. All right, man. So covered a lot today. I hope you found it useful. If you didn't find it useful, email me and let me know, and we'll revamp this and we'll do it again. I'm more than happy to do so. Again, my email is mike@sheepdogresponse.com. Whatever questions you have, questions about the lifestyle, questions about vetting an academy, questions about what medical equipment you should be carrying or what medical training you should attend, what's coming down the pipe as far as the future of tactical emergency medicine, because I got a glimpse into that very recently. I'll talk about that on a future podcast. Hit me up. Shoot me an email. Nothing makes me happier than answering those emails. And with that, I'm going to close today with a quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "The true test of civilization is not the census, nor the size of the cities, nor the crops, but the kind of man that the country turns out." What kind of men and women are we turning out today? You got to wonder about that. Well, I hope that I'm the type of man that Ralph Waldo Emerson would have been proud of, and I hope you're living that way too. And until next time, be a sheepdog.
You have been listening to the Sheepdog Project. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Sheepdog Response. The views expressed on this podcast are those of the individual and do not represent any larger entity, public or private.